Hey, I want to talk a bit about part of the world which is really, I think it's fair to say, a failed state, Yemen. Um, and the angle I want to approach with this is just an observation of the history of that country. And this is not intended to be very, very academic and very in depth because I would be misleading people to say I'm some sort of expert. Obviously, I'm not. But I've spent a bit of time sort of looking into the modern history of the country and some of the basic outline details of some of the things that have been going on there. So, what is the purpose of making this video? Well, I just feel that in this world, there's no equilibrium between countries, right? Um, but at the very least, all human conflicts should get some sort of coverage. They should get attention. Yemen, for a long time, has been a kind of festering tragedy that for a long time has kind of been second place news to Syria. Arguably, there's far more people have died in Syria, actually, if you look at the statistics. But in terms of being a miserable place, Yemen definitely is very close to that title. It is one of the most dismal places on earth. And to any Yemeni people watching this, um, that's my honest perception. I don't intend to be offensive with that, but looking at Yemen's modern history, it's very, very difficult to see much in the way of positivity. Since 1948, I have counted 14 separate armed conflicts, 14 separate armed conflicts in the territory now known as Yemen. Um, Another reason I guess I feel prompted to make this video is because I'm well aware that my country, Britain, has a lot to answer for, as we do with much of the Middle East. And whilst I'm patriotic, whilst I will defend my country when we're unfairly criticised, I also feel it is important to be honest. We have a lot to answer for. We really do. Not least our current arming of the Saudi campaign, but I'll come to that. What's prompted me also to think about all of this is, of course, the news that Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, was killed 2 days ago. Now, this is interesting because it's got a lot less coverage than the death of Gaddafi 6 years ago, and yet the circumstances are pretty similar. Both countries are going through a brutal civil war. Both leaders died violent deaths. Both leaders, there were viral videos going around afterwards, although, again, with Salah, it hasn't got as much attention. But very similar. Although there are some differences. Salah was already dead when the video was circulating, whereas Gaddafi was basically being killed in the video, which is one reason it got so much controversy. Um, at this point, I probably should mention the Gaddafi thing briefly. My own take on the death of Gaddafi, I'm thinking here specifically of his death. It was brutal. There's no way around that. It was not a pleasant thing to see. He died a brutal death. But what irritates me somewhat about a lot of internet opinion when it comes to Gaddafi, people are overly sympathetic to him. I mean, I don't condone the way he died. It was horrible. But let's not forget, Gaddafi was a brutal dictator who murdered thousands of his own people. That's irrefutable. He had sponsored terrorism for years. He was responsible for the worst terrorist attack on British soil, Lockerbie. People seem to forget that when it comes to Gaddafi. And I must say, Libya is one of those situations where the West is always going to be blamed, but people conveniently forget that in 2011, when Gaddafi chose to use brute force against legitimate protests, um, there were people cheering Sarkozy and Cameron on the streets of Benghazi and actually waving the British flag and begging for international intervention. Now, the problem with pretty much every conflict in North Africa and the Middle East is there is always Islamist players. So when the West intervenes, if the West acts against a dictator, the counter argument is always going to be At some point, Western aid is going to get into the hands of Islamists. Then it makes it look like the West is arming Islamists as a state policy. Now, I'm skeptical of that theory because I think it would be totally like shooting ourselves in the foot. Nevertheless, it is irrefutable that Western money has ended up in the hands of some pretty nasty organizations. It's just been revealed that Western aid, for example, in Syria, has had to be cancelled because it has ended up in the hands of Islamist groups. Now, when you get Russian state propaganda, Russia, of course, is a major player, then they manage to distort this, say, oh, look, the West is funding terrorists. The truth is, when it comes to the Middle East, none of the big powers are innocent. None of us. Britain is not innocent. France is not innocent. Russia definitely is not innocent, despite its claims to be some sort of, for example, liberator of the Syrian people. The truth is, the Middle East is like a big chessboard. And the blunt reality is, there isn't a single major power that can claim innocence. By major powers, I'm talking basically United States, France, Britain, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. More or less those six countries, Egypt to some extent, but Egypt's got plenty of its own problems. Um, so when it comes to the Middle East, there is no innocent player at all. All these countries have blood on their hands. But we are looking at propaganda wars, and when Russia points a finger at the West, I do feel it's important to counter that argument. One thing I will say though is at least the West, at least when it was revealed that this aid in Syria was being directed into the hands of Islamist groups, at least the program was cancelled. That to me indicates that it was more naivety or misplacement rather than deliberately arming Islamist groups as a state policy, whereas Russia has, as a state policy, been arming the Assad regime as a state policy. Now, you could point out Britain and France has been arming Saudi Arabia as a state policy. So when it comes to the Middle East, I think we all have to be careful about pointing fingers. Some people might say, well, Nathan, you're very critical about Russia. The reason I'm so critical about Russia, and I made this point before, is because when it comes to Russia today, there is no balance at all. I feel it necessary to counter their arguments because they're just throwing out this completely one sided propaganda. The BBC, you cannot claim that the BBC just promotes pro British propaganda. That simply isn't accurate because the BBC does question the British government in a way that RT does not do with the Russian government. That's a fact. Now, you could argue they don't do it enough or whatever, but there's simply no comparison there. That is why I get so vocal when it comes to Russia's role in the Middle East, because I think it is utterly stomach churning that Russia plays this role where it constantly points fingers at the West, and yet it is culpable for an enormous amount of bloodshed in the Middle East as well. I mean, it's very clear that Putin is trying to cement his hold in Syria and that region. The fact of the matter is, the entire Middle East is a chessboard. That's a tragedy, and all the major powers are culpable. Now, if I was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, would I automatically execute ties to Saudi Arabia? I would like to say the moral side of me says yes, that's the right thing to do because British weapons are killing Yemeni civilians, despite our push for the Saudis to be very careful about it. It happens. But the reality is, geopolitics can never be idealist. It can never be perfect because the nature of geopolitics is that it will always, always, always be a murky world. No matter how much leaders maybe want to be righteous, want to do the right thing, the nature of power and politics is that there will always be that murky side to it. And that's, I can understand why people are cynical about it because that's the reality of power. And that's a blunt truth. Every country in the world will fundamentally look out for its own interests. So my country is no different. We arm the Saudis because Saudi Arabia gives us assurances that they're keeping us secure. I'm personally skeptical of that, but the viewpoint of the British government. I would argue our support for Saudi Arabia probably does more to fuel the propaganda of Islamist groups because they say the British are arming brutal Arab dictators. Cameron acknowledged that when he made his speech in Cairo in 2011, yet we still do it with the Saudis. And, when I think of the sort of things that Saudi Arabia does, not just the brutal campaign in Yemen, but also internally, their appalling human rights record, the way they treat atheists, the way they treated Raif Badawi, for example, it makes my stomach turn. And I do feel if I was the Prime Minister, I would totally put an ultimatum down to these people. Saudi Arabia is a powerful country, but it's not all powerful, and it's widely mistrusted within the greater Middle East. So I do think probably we are a bit too close, but I don't think it would be realistic to totally cut off relations. Now, people might say, well, the solution to this is totally stay out of the Middle East completely. The problem is we are now so deeply involved in Middle East politics that if we done that, if we completely retracted, we'd end up being in a situation where, kind of our various allegiances come back to haunt us. So at the moment, for example, with the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, there's growing intelligence that ISIS fighters are now looking elsewhere, for example, Egypt and Europe. And I think we're going to see this ISIS, it's like a never ending Cold War. What I will say in summary when it comes to the Middle East, and I'd intended this video to be just about Yemen, but the whole Middle East is interconnected. So it's impossible, I think, to make a video about the Middle East and focus on one country because the entire region is interconnected. And what we've been seeing in the last few years is clearly this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia are as bad as each other, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to human rights. So when it comes to the Middle East, no power is innocent. None of them are. Whether it be Western or Arab, no power is innocent. Um, that doesn't mean there aren't people in the region who are trying to do the right thing. Uh, um, but the tragedy of this is that the nature of geopolitics, if we look at the last 2 decades, perhaps no region in the world has been as geopolitically important as the Middle East. If we think of the 70s, it was Southeast Asia. The 2000s and the 2010s, it's the Middle East. Although East Asia would probably be a runner-up with the tensions in the Korean Peninsula. But yeah, the Middle East is seen as far more important than conflicts in Africa. Seems far more important than South America. The reason could be that a lot of the long-running South American conflicts did actually reach conclusions in the 90s. But yeah, it's like a maze inside a puzzle inside an enigma. That's the Middle East. But to get back to Yemen, so yeah, Saleh was killed. Um, you won't see very many people feeling sorry for him. Someone said, this is what happens when you play both sides. Salah, of course, changed his allegiances and turned against the Houthis in the past few days. Um, Yemen, like a lot of conflicts, neither side is totally innocent. I certainly don't trust the Houthis. Certainly no indication that they're moderates. But then Saudi's brutal intervention has been causing enormous suffering to the Yemeni people in a country that doesn't need any more suffering. So let's have a brief look at Yemen's modern history. By modern, I mean post World War II. The Al Waziri coup, 1948. That was the first conflict. The Yemeni Adenese clan violence, 1956 to 1960. And when it comes to clan violence and the clan politics, I think there's similarities there with Libya. The North Yemen Civil War, by far the bloodiest conflict in Yemen, anywhere from 100 to 200,000 dead. It was one of many major wars during the Cold War. It's not the best documented, but it was a very costly conflict between 1962 and 1970. The Aden Emergency. Um, it was lasted for a period of about 4 years, 1963 to 1967. It was one of the last sort of simmering conflicts, you could say, of the British Empire. Aden was a British military outpost. With Indian partition, it became less important. And basically, in theory, British troops were there as peacekeepers, but they were seen as the colonial occupiers. About 2,000 people killed in that unrest. The 1972 North and South Yemen border war. North and South Yemen had now become separate countries. The NDF rebellion, 1978 to 1982. Uh, Another border war in 1979. The South Yemen Civil War, 1986. Anywhere up to 10,000 killed in that conflict. The Yemeni Civil War, this was a unified Yemen now, the country unified in 1990. Civil War 1994, another 10,000 killed. The Al Qaeda insurgency has been brewing since 1998 in Yemen, hundreds killed in that. The Houthi insurgency since 2004. Um, and you could argue that was ongoing, but Wikipedia lists it as ending in 2015 with the Houthi takeover of Sana'a. The South Yemen insurgency, the Yemeni Revolution, which of course was part of the wider Arabian Spring, about 2,000 killed in that unrest, when of course Saleh was deposed. And finally, the Yemeni civil war from 2015 onwards, which is really all of these conflicts that have been brought to the fore now. They've all been amalgamated together, and so far the estimates are about 10,000 people killed in this. Now, added to all of this year there has been a cholera outbreak, over 2,000 killed. Altogether, I've worked out from all these conflicts, over 200,000 people killed, many thousands displaced. So basically, in the last 60 years, Yemen hasn't had a break. And it seems to be one of those countries like Somalia, like both Sudans, like Iraq, Afghanistan, that just seems to be in a perpetual state of unrest and war. There is an argument that in countries like this, you need a strong man like Salah to kind of keep the stability. But I think Salah's demise and Salah's tenure contradict that theory because Salah's tenure was not stable. Salah's flip flopping from one side to another caused constant mistrust, and he was like a classic dictator. He was known as the mini Saddam. Apparently, he liked to drink, and there's a lot of story floating around about Salah. He wasn't as well known as some other dictators, certainly not as well known as Gaddafi or Saddam, but I think that kind of contradicts the strong man provides stability argument. I think that argument is a flawed argument. Um, but within Syria, Assad must be looking at this and thinking Gaddafi's dead, Salah is dead, Mugabe's been deposed in Zimbabwe, although that's a totally different region. Um, Assad clearly has the upper hand in the Syrian civil war, but if if he doesn't take an approach of having some sort of reconciliation or moderation, I think he's going to end up the same way. And I have to say, I have little sympathy. It's not that I have any desire to see Islamist groups take over. There's a thing better, the devil you know. But the way I see it is, it's always this choice: dictatorship or terrorism, instability, Islamism. And quite often you get relatively secular dictators. I mean, these guys, Saddam, Gaddafi to some extent, Salah, Assad, none of them were religious fanatics. They used religion, for their internal politics of the country, but none of them were particularly devout. I mean, Salah was a drinker. Um, Saddam was certainly a classic dictator. Gaddafi was probably the most religious out of the four. But basically, dictators are like the stereotype. They're playboys. They love power, and I really think that religion is convenient for them. I don't think any of them are particularly devout. Well, some are, certainly the Ayatollah in Iran. But what am I driving at with all of this? I think when it comes to the Middle East, there is no clear answer. Already, this story is moving on to Trump's. Trump's going to imminently declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel, which I think is a big mistake. I happen to believe in the right for Israel to exist, but I think that would be a grave mistake and it will cause instability in the region. But that's about right for Donald Trump. The man totally lacks statesmanship, and I think it's a. I really think Trump doesn't think things through, and I think he's going to be remembered as the worst American president in living memory, because it's one thing looking strong with the Israelis, but the Middle East, like I say, is a puzzle inside an enigma, and I think you have to really play things very carefully. And I think Trump is playing with fire. I could be wrong, but I think he's playing with fire. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I just hope that at some point in the future, in my lifetime, there will be a much, much happier picture for these countries. But the truth is, in a country like Yemen, it's the poorest country in the Middle East. The problems seem so deeply ingrained, the tribalism, the poverty, these problems seem so deeply ingrained that it becomes very, very difficult to be optimistic at all. And I do wonder what approach would actually work. Clearly, the last thing Yemen needs is more conflict. So that's why I do think the British position, I really do think that we need to review our arms trade to Saudi Arabia. But there's no easy answer, because then the Saudis would say, well, you allow the Houthis to take over there, posing a threat to us, because the Houthis have fired rockets into Saudi Arabia. So they would use the same argument Israel uses with the Palestinians. And the Houthis did claim that they fired at the United Arab Emirates. But as always with these things, it's the civilians that get caught in the middle of it. But before people demonize my country completely, we also contribute an enormous amount in humanitarian aid, not just in this part of the world, but in other parts of the world. So I will be honest about my country, but I also won't stand by and watch the likes of Russia um, demonize or vilify Britain when they're doing exactly the same thing. When it comes to the Middle East, no country is innocent, and that's the tragic reality. I'll leave it there, and thank you for watching.